Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. I hope this moment finds you well, and welcome to our broadcast. I'm your host, Raj Agarwal, president of Provoc. As a reminder, the information provided during this event is for educational purposes only. It is not intended, nor is it implied, to be a substitute for professional medical advice. If you have any questions regarding medical conditions or treatment plans, please consult your physician. Now let's begin. Joining me during this live event will be Dr. Michelle Jennings of the Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, Dr. Nellie Tran of the Asian American Psychological Association, Dr. Theopia Jackson of the Association of Black Psychologists, and Dr. Fiorella Carlos Chavez of the National Latinx Psychological Association. So before I turn it over to these wonderful people to introduce themselves, our collective team and Facebook and Providence have been working on a month-long campaign on how to deliver culturally relevant resources to the communities that are represented by these 4 ethnic psychological associations. And before we go into that, I just want to say my gratitude to these 4 individuals on how I am completely transformed as a result of our time together, and that the wisdom that I have just been able to receive has been such a gift to me, and I know it will be a gift for all of the viewers. And so I plan to talk as little as possible today so that you can really hear from these 4 wisdom keepers. And so with that, I'd love to start to do some introductions, and we'll start with Dr. Chavez.
Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Fiorella Chavez. I am a first-year assistant professor at Arizona State University at the College of Nursing and Health Innovation. I'm very happy to be here today with you, and I look forward to connecting with you during the Q&A.
Great, and let's just go around. What we have here is Dr. Michelle Johnson Jennings.
Halito, so Chipia Michelle Johnson Jennings, Michaina Inkisha Bokuna, Jaktasio Hoke. I am Michelle Johnson Jennings. I'm a clinical health psychologist from the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. And I'm also just beginning as a full professor at the University of Washington and director of environmental land-based healing. And I am very happy to be here and feel honored that you've invited me. So I appreciate that. And I have to mention too, I'm also a mother of 4 kiddos. So I find that very enriching for my life and practice. So you're okay.
Dr. Jackson.
Greetings and hotep to the family who's out here listening. It is a pleasure to be here, particularly among such ethnic brilliance that's here. So thank you for the invitation, the opportunity. In addition to having the pleasure of serving as the president of the Association of Black Psychologists, I am also a licensed clinical psychologist specializing in pediatric and family services. And I'm currently the chair for the clinical psychology degree program at Saybrook University, as well as the Division 32 member at large which is the Society for Humanistic Psychology.
Thank you. And Dr. Tran.
Hi, I'm Nellie Tran. I am serving as the president of the Asian American Psychological Association. I'm also an associate professor of counseling and school psychology at San Diego State University. I'm also the daughter of Vietnamese refugee boat people and a mother of 2. Happy to be here and excited about our conversation together.
Excellent, thank you. So why don't we start a little bit about talking about each of the racial and ethnic psychological associations, how they came to be, and what makes them unique from other organizations. Who feels called to start?
Well, if I may, I'd like to step in because the Association of Black Psychologists was the first ethnic psychological association to stand boldly in that place, and we are honored by that, and are here with our continued support of our fellow family members here. So the Association of Black Psychologists began in 1968 by a group of Black professionals and graduate students. And what was happening at that particular time for most of America to remember was, in fact, the civil rights movement, where there was a heightened awareness around the disenfranchisement of people of color, particularly Black folks, and more specifically, within the field of psychology, we critically recognize that this played a significant role in the misrepresentation and at best, and at worst, the disenfranchisement of our children and families. So for example, the prevalence of Black children being placed in special ed as if there was something wrong with them was really more about the tools are being used to discern, quote, their intelligence. But we'll get into that later. But in 1968, these were actually members of the American Psychological Association. It was having its international convention in San Francisco. And when this group of Black professionals and graduate students stood up and said, hey, wait, we need to look at our science and understand the role it plays in this. At that particular time, APA denied needing to do that. It was really of a mindset that its way of science and psychology was accurate and the way for all. And so this group denounced its membership and instead came together and said, so now what do we do? And they began the Association of Black Psychologists and then set out to define what is Black psychology, which is really trying to understand what it means to be healthy and whole from a culturally centered perspective. And so this was a multidisciplinary approach to trying to, one, help the mainstream psychology understand its shortcomings and the harm it was causing in Black communities. Two, to resurrect and re-message the goodness of Blackness. And three, to be very clear about looking at our African roots to see what, if any, knowledge is still important for us today, because even though many of us are direct descendants of those who were initially trafficked here in 1619, within our DNA still lives some of the spiritual practices and beliefs. We just may have lost a consciousness for why we do what we do. So I'll stop there, but there we are.
I'll go next. So if we're doing this chronologically, in 1972, the Asian American Psychological Association came into existence. Our founders, our first president was Daryl Wing Sue, commonly known now for his work in microaggressions. But him and his brother, Stanley Sue, along with a group of other mental health professionals across social work and master's level psychologists, actually came together in the San Francisco Bay Area, wanting to support one another, wanting to talk about Asian American psychology and work together to promote mental health, well-being and understanding of Asian American peoples and communities. Since then, we've grown to a membership of over 1,400 individuals, and we focus a great deal not just on Asian American psychology and studying our people, but also in supporting one another. And that's been one of our biggest challenges over the years, is making sure that our people are able to achieve their goals. Many of us are sprinkled across the country and end up in very isolated places. And we are peoples who need others. We need to be around and among one another to inspire and motivate and find support in one another. So we have a large convention now every single year where we come together to inspire, to support, to heal, to become whole again, so that we can go back out into our respective areas to continue to support our community and do the good work that we're doing and continue the good fight. And we are grateful to be a part of collaborations and solidarities with the group of people here. And we wouldn't be in existence if it wasn't for all of the solidarity work that has helped us to grow as an organization and to continue to reach out to folks who don't know of our existence. So we do have a convention coming up in October that is virtual, and we're very excited about that. And we hope that folks know that even though we are the Psychological Association, our origins as well as where we are headed actually includes folks who care about mental wellness from all walks of life and all different professions. Thank you.
I will go next. I think for NLPA, it had a very recent origin. So NLPA was founded in 2002. One of the core founders was Dr. Patricia Redondo. And although it had originally existed as part of the Hispanic Association for Psychologists in 1979, it began to lose momentum. So after 2002, our association became bigger, stronger, drew a lot of Latina, Hispanic psychologists to join the association. And we have had our conference every year since then. I have 2 years with NLPA, and I actually found the association towards the end of my PhD years. And it was through Dr. Andrea Romero who asked me and recommended me to join NLPA as a young professional. So I'm very grateful for that. I think NLPA is still growing. We need the hard labor and the enthusiasm of students, young professionals who sometimes feel that they are alone, that they are the only ones in the field to continue this work, who are passionate about family values, immigrant health, migration and refugee rights, and the core values of family and psychological well-being defined by the Latino and Hispanic people. So we always are hoping to expand Latinx family, and this is a venue that students can reach out. I certainly did, as I said, towards the end of my PhD education. We have our conference every year. This year is going to be online in October. So we'll definitely look forward to meeting a variety of people through the internet. Fortunately, we cannot meet in person, but it's a great venue. If you're looking for mentorship, specific groups related to your core research interests, whether it is LGBTQ families, immigration health, migrant families, well-being, parent-child separation at the border. So different types of interest, I think students and young professionals can find a home in NLPA. Thank you.
Dr. Chavez, would you mind sharing why there was a need for a national Latinx psychological association, and what was the need for even starting the organization?
Well, briefly, what I know is that there was we were not considered part of what is called the traditional way to do psychology, and we realizing that what was out there for APA was not working for the specific Spanish population in the United States, the Latino population in the United States, in terms of taking cultural values into consideration when offering treatment, taking different perspectives, even the language that we communicate in Spanish or other native tongues with the population. So that was part of the core need to have an association that was from Latinos, Latinx folks to other Latinx community, families, individuals, and students to find that representation and to nourish students and the community through the work that we do.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jennings?
Well, I'm a bit of the odd one, I should say. So we are the Indigenous Research Wellness Institute, or Erie, as what we say for short. There is, I should give a head nod, there is a Society of Indian Psychologists that have been around since, I believe, the late 70s, and who still function today and do a lot of similar work. I'm a psychologist that's gone a bit rogue, I'm afraid. So I've now in a school of social work, but I'm with Erie because Erie was really founded as a way to work with Indigenous communities through a decolonizing lens. So throughout history, psychology, similar to Dr. Jackson and Tran as they were speaking, as well as Chavez. I mean, we've had a bittersweet relationship with psychology. Some of the foundational information from psychology has actually come from Indigenous communities, whereas at the same time, even the Stanford Binet test was developed to declare Indigenous children feeble-minded and to enforce removing children from homes as well as forced sterilization. So we have a fraught history within that. And so Erie was really established by Dr. Karina Walters and Dr. Tessa Evans Campbell to be a way to bring people together around mental health and well-being. And though they are social workers, clinical social workers as well. It's been very open from the beginning to those who are in psychology, other mental health fields, counseling, as well as health in general, and works to bring in trainees, to work with them to train within Indigenous communities, to train in ways that are culturally appropriate, and to really elevate the needs of the communities. The other reason I believe that Erie was so attractive for me, even as I was a doctoral student or a master's student, was because they really approach health and well-being as a holistic point of view, right? So it's not just that we have psychology or mental health over here and physical health over here or emotional health over there, but it's more about all the spiritual, emotional well-being combined, and that affects the whole person. And so a lot of the work that happens here is with communities and helping them heal themselves with our ancestral practices that we've always known are very effective and have always been very helpful for us as communities. And remembering that the majority of Indigenous people are healthy and well. Like across North America, when we do community surveys, we see 67% of Indigenous people rate their health as high, their well-being as high. So we need to keep that in mind as well, instead of just focusing on the deficits, which I'm afraid a lot of times we do within psychology, and even with my own training, a lot of times we're focused on those disparities instead of elevating those strengths, those riches that we have that currently exist and have always existed within our communities.
Thank you, Dr. Jennings. My assessment is sometimes, when we hear one another, there are new things that come up that we'd also like to share. Would anybody like to add on to anything that based on what they've heard so far?
I would welcome that invitation. Thank you. I would be remiss if I didn't also clarify that ABPSI continues to be independent. And more specifically, our mission is threefold. First and foremost, it's to elevate the African spirit, if you will, to also illuminate that spirit. More specifically, we want to do what we call psychological liberation of the African mind and empowerment of the African character. And so that is a beautiful framework for who we are and what we do, because even though it's called the Association of Black Psychologists, many of our members are not psychologists, but they are grounded in this work. Many of them are healers and movers in their own community towards the mission I just spoke of. And we are also international. So we're engaged in conversations with our folks around the diaspora, and specifically working very closely with the Forum of African Psychology, which is our counterparts in South Africa, and talking about a Pan-African psychology. Because what we're saying here is that when it comes to people of African ancestry, no matter where they are, they're still sort of dealing with this lie of white supremacy and this lie of Black inferiority. It just manifests itself differently. So, and I want to be clear too, as we listen to our colleagues, we are not an alternative to anything. We are specifically locating ourselves in the psychology and spirituality of who we are, defined by us. Because as my dear colleague has already said for Dr. Jennings, many times when we've been taught as Western psychologists to look at something, it's more from a problem-saturated place, and particularly for Black Americans, where they would have to always have a control group. You compare us to, and that control group is always European and white. And whatever the difference is, somehow it's something wrong with us versus something wrong with the conceptualization. I give examples of this when we think about family. For a very long time, and it's still sort of weaving its way into the fabric of America, it defined family as heterosexual couple biologically connected to their children. And anything that was compared to that at that time, there's something wrong with them. Well, I would like to suggest to you that because of the heavy lifting done by many of our founders and social scientists and others in pushing the value of multiculturalism, that even European America has been able to embrace the fact that family is much more diverse than that very linear and contained space. So our voice moving forward brought value to the fact that a child can come from a single parent home, and that's not automatically mean there's something wrong with them, because many of us are thriving in those settings. And usually the defining factor, which is some of our centrality again, is sitting in community. So health and wellness exists within a communal place. I just want to close by saying that. And so we do have right now more than 1,000 members, and I want to give support to my colleagues who are about to go into the virtual space, where ABPSI just launched its virtual conference this past July. Lots of lessons learned, lots of beautiful opportunities gained. I'll be happy to help you in any way we can too. Thank you for that clarifying moment.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Jackson. I was going to ask you a little bit all about how you actually work together, but I think maybe we should just go in this thread that Dr. Jackson just shared, which is what are some misconceptions of Western psychology that continue to produce harm for African American, Black communities, Latinx communities, Asian American and American Indian, Native American and Alaskan Native members and communities? And I'm just curious, again, pulling on that thread, what promises does it deliver on, and where does it fall short? And in that, there's this other aspect that Dr. Jackson also pulled on, which is this sense of community. So the fact is that you're each going to be talking about it from a broad sense and then specifically to each of your communities. But then how does that cultivate the ability for your 4 organizations to work together?
I'd love to jump in here because I've got, I was reminded of many things as my colleagues were speaking. In Asian American psychology, I think we have followed the lead and been quite inspired and have a great debt to owe to ABPSI and our colleagues in Black psychology. Over the years, at first it was just trying to be together, just to be in each other's presence, to support one another, and just to begin the work of making sure Asian Americans were considered, were included in any studies, and at enough of a consideration to be named, right? And over the years, we've grown to have our own journal, which has really amplified the work and allowed people to push our understanding of the discipline and of our peoples and communities. I think a lot about, strength-based is great, but many of the stereotypes of Asian Americans are considered positive. And so the question I ask is, strength-based according to who? Who gets to decide what our strengths are? Because certainly in our upbringing, the strengths that I brought from my cultural origins were not considered acceptable by the general public. But yet the strengths that are identified by others, whether that be my cultural values or my, my submissiveness or, things like that, those are acceptable strengths to have. So I think our organization has really attempted to do the work by the community, for the community. And I think that is a really important point, that we're doing things and promoting our own people, so that if we can amplify and promote our own graduate students, our own professionals and providers, then they can return home to provide services to our community. We don't always have to just educate others to come into our communities to serve, right? While that may be necessary as we walk through these transitions, I think we are all now at a place where we want folks who feel connected to our roots and have a genuine understanding of the values of where we come from, right? We all bring with us generational wisdom and resilience. Our people have been through more than we can speak of, more than we can even acknowledge many times, and we can tap into that. We don't merely have to be trained from a Western lens through our education, which is still very Eurocentric. And I think the problem there is that we keep, in psychology, we keep getting pushed into therapy, for example. That if you are not well, you must go to therapy, but therapy itself has not become more culturally oriented to us. And so I always ask, is the stigma against mental health, is it just purely a cultural one? Because we have been led to believe that there are cultural stigmas within our communities that we're unwilling to go to therapy. And I also ask, but how many of us have gone to therapy and have been made worse, have been told that we are wrong and bad, and made to believe that we have to change, that we must, the one I fixate on these days is that we must individuate from our families, right? So the one value that I have that I actually want to hold on to, you're telling me makes me sick, makes me ill. And if that's the message I'm going to get, and I have to release my belongings, my goals, then perhaps I don't want to go back, right? That's not to say that there aren't times in our lives in which that type of individuation and separation is necessary for healing. But when there's only a one solution approach, right? Then in my culture, my shame, all these things that I find to be very cultural is only bad, then maybe therapy isn't the right choice for me. And I think that there isn't a match yet. So it's hard to push people towards therapy when therapy isn't very culturally oriented to begin with. So perhaps then it's not that we only have a stigma to therapy, but rather we have a stigma to bad therapy, culturally incompetent therapy, and that stigma is warranted until I can have someone who actually helps me to heal. So I think a lot about this. And the other part of this is I've been to several trainings where mindfulness is taught, right? And there's this bastardization of mindfulness. I grew up as a Buddhist, and I feel like, well, one, I was made to be I was shamed for my Buddhist upbringings. And now I'm being told, that I need to be more mindful, but it's being used to promote the individual. It's not being used to promote the collective. And if you do mindfulness in a Buddhist tradition, then it should lead us to a place of wanting to fight for justice, fight for collectivism, fight for community. And instead, it's being used to tell me to be calm and chill in a toxic work environment or a toxic classroom environment. And that's where I feel like that's not okay. And I feel like when people come together in our organizations, we all kind of have these feelings on our own, but there's so many messages that tell us that we are wrong for thinking that, and that I haven't read the literature well enough to understand what these white scholars are saying, right? I don't need that. I was raised in the tradition. I have thousands of years worth of teachings in me, but I've been socialized to believe that what is taught in school is what is correct, right? So when we come together, then we have our elders with us who can retrain us to believe in ourselves again and believe the voice that we have, believe the truths that I know to be true, but are constantly being beat out of me in my daily work life. So I'm now losing track of what the question was, but I do feel like, one of the reasons why it's so important that we have these communities, that we come together, that we are able to reconnect, right, is that we are more whole. I am more whole when I can connect to my generational roots, to my upbringing, to my ancestors, all of whom have been looking after me, but perhaps have been ignored a little bit. And together, I am stronger, I am more powerful, and we are more powerful and strong. I'll stop there.
Dr. Tran, I had one question for you because I really enjoyed the specifics of the different traits that you named. And there was one thing about shame that you had also mentioned before, and what the distinction is and how shame shows up in a Western context versus in your cultural context.
Yeah, so this one rings very personal to me because I've always thought of, many Asian cultures, Vietnamese culture being a shame-based culture, that shame is something we talk a lot about. And, when the shame work became very mainstream, I remember having to go back to my family to ask about this concept of shame. The word that I translated to English shame was sauho, which means in literal, it's like an ugly feeling, like it's an ugly thing that happened. And when I asked my sister-in-law, who is much more bicultural than I am, she said, I was like, is that a way to make me feel bad? Like when mom says that, what does she mean? And she explained it to me as she's saying that because she's taking responsibility for her piece of what you did. Right. And she's saying this is so ugly because I should have done better. And it's not just you should have done better. It's that, how did we let this happen? Right. How did our collective let this happen? So if I were in Vietnam still, there would have been a diffusion of responsibility over this thing that I should feel shameful for. But here in the US, I was born and raised in the US. And so I've turned everything inward. I take everything as though it is a personal attack, right? Because I don't have that cultural, I don't have that same cultural upbringing as I would have had if I were in Vietnam. And so as a more Americanized person, I'm taking this and not learning the diffusion of responsibility piece because the translation got lost. And so rather than feeling a shared sense of shame, which would have been less, I do the American thing, the European version, which is I blame myself. And then I get mad at my mom for having shamed me or blamed me for it, right? And so there's this translation of the concept that doesn't work. She's not trying to create this inner shame, but the mixing of the two cultures for me and the lack of the education of Vietnamese and Asian culture is what has produced this kind of really, this shame that eats me up inside, right? So perhaps I could get retrained around the concept of shame by reading, famous authors that have written about it, or I can turn to my upbringing and to my roots and learn more about my Vietnamese heritage and how this shared sense of responsibility could be understood in all the ways that I am taking responsibility for things that should be shared. And I feel like that helps me more holistically than thinking about how I did shame wrong,
Thank you, Dr. Tran. I'm seeing a lot of head nods from our fellow panelists with us. And Dr. Jackson, please, I saw you'd come off mute.
Yeah, I would love to try to unpack some of that specific to our space. And thank you again, Dr. Tran. So in terms of examples, explicit ones to keep in mind is that this myth that Black folks do not like therapy. First and foremost, I want to raise up comments that I know that many Black psychologists have shared, but has probably not been heard. First and foremost, there has not been a therapy, if you will, specific to dealing with the residuals of having been kidnapped, trafficked, slaved, beaten, sexually abused for 400 plus years. So the American Psychological Association and every other mental health healthcare industry did not step into the space to say, quote, if we're freeing the body, if we call that being free from emancipation, it's a whole other conversation to have. The realities were there was no treatment, for lack of a better word as well, available to the generations who've been contending with what they contend with. So I want to say clearly, the fact that we still are here is evidence to our perseverance in life. And yet somehow in our healthcare industry, Black seems to be equated with something wrong. So I'll give you another example of this. Carol Stack, I believe was her name, in the early 70s was a white social worker who wanted to understand more of this behavior that's been documented among Black folks of having family-like relationships, even though there's no legal or biological relatedness, calling each other cousins or sharing resources. So she was able to sort of do a good little study living in the quote projects for several months of observing how families interacted. And when she went to try to interpret this, give it meaning, why are Black parents raising each other's children? Why are they sharing resources and giving up each other's money? These types of, the meaning they gave to that was in response to racism or poverty. It took Black psychologists, Black researchers to take a deeper dive because they understood that in our DNA, we just do that. It had nothing to do with the situation. It's because it was already part of our DNA that allowed us to survive our situations. Because if you go anywhere in the world, you put enough people of African ancestry together long enough, they're going to start acting like family. And is that innate capacity is what was a protective factor for us that we may have let go of as we continue to acclimate to the Western way of being. As I say this, I'll be clear for the listeners. I am not saying that everything about psychology is wrong. That's not even my issue. What I'm trying to say is that when it has positioned itself in such a way that it raises the probability of harm because of how it interprets and brings meaning forward. The other examples I give too is around testing. So the Association of Black Psychologists with folks like our dear Dr. William Thomas were crucial in the Larry P. case in California that clearly demonstrated that the use of intelligence tests was adversely impacting the capacity for Black children and instead disenfranchising them, as I said, into a special ed classroom when their intelligence was not the issue. The questions being asked of them was wrong, and the context in which how they were being taught was wrong. It was not aligned with who they are. I also want to lift up the work of people like Dr. Reginald Jones, who spent a lifetime clearly documenting the problems within the testing system so that people have this resource already. This is not something that we're starting anew. This is well grounded. I want to add too, when people think about research, they want to always talk about Tuskegee, but let's be very clear. Research has continued to play a harm in many communities of color, particularly Black communities. I want to lift up the most recent study was done in Baltimore in terms of the lead study. It replicated Tuskegee, where somehow this was approved, that they recognized that many of the homes and the buildings in the Baltimore area had a high level of lead. So some social scientists wanted to be curious about the impact of lead, high lead on the developing body, which of course were our Black children. So without formally informing the parents, they said, hey, come be part of the study and I will give your child good health care and never told the parents that their children were exposed to high levels of lead. We already know that that's wrong. This was just done in our lifetime. So it's not about Tuskegee. It is about research has predominantly done harm in our communities. We look at, and I want to lift up the book too, it was done medical apartheid. When we look at many of our practices for good healthcare now, they practice it on Black bodies. You know, this myth that Black women can tolerate pain, so you're using our bodies with no anesthesia and watching us go through this pain in order to make something safe for who? White women. So this is serious here, and it's not about individual therapists who are intentionally trying to do harm, even though I could tell you those exist as well too. It's more about the science itself is coming from what I call a poisonous well. You cannot start the United States of America on the idea of freedom when you're coming here and eradicating the people who already live here. Or you're coming here trafficking in Black bodies because they're easier to find and define as your slaves and so they can blend in. You can't start the United States of America talking about freedom when this is how you're birthing it. And our science continues to pull from that. We have not corrected that. So there are lots of evidence of harm historically and contemporary. Yes, there may have been some good done in here. I'm not taking away from that, but that's not our focus today. What we're trying to say is there's important information that's missing. And because in my perspective, our psychology is built upon the back of white supremacy ideology and capitalism, it cannot see and accept its role in perpetuating the fact that Black people need to stay being socialized as patients. Because when I come in and I'm being anxious, I'm nervous, I'm telling you that I feel like I'm being followed in a store, okay? What am I usually told by the good trained therapist? Irrational thinking, hypervigilance, when we all know in our hood that this is clearly implicit bias and racism operating, that this is for real. So you've spent years trying to tell my people that there's something wrong with them for thinking that way. And yet we have clear science that shows that when you're exposed to racial trauma, it can not only lead to psychological challenges, but also physical ones in terms of diabetes, heartache, and whatnot. So again, where we're trying to go is, again, not to just simply say what's wrong, but to be clear about what's needed. And so as I close by adding what's needed, I want to honor the work of many of our scholars who've moved significant theories forward that's about our mental health and wellness, lifting up first and foremost Dr. Linda James Myers in terms of our optimal theory, if you will, talking about the work of even Nancy Boyd Franklin, who's played a crucial role in helping to shift how we think about Black families and being able to see the fullness and the goodness of who they are. They're sitting in situations. It's not what's wrong with them. I also want to say too, I would ask folks to let go of the languaging of at-risk youth. They're not at-risk youth. They are at potential and at-risk environments. The reason I say that is because language can be both liberating as well as condescending, if you will, and problematic. If we say at-risk youth, then our Western thinking says the problem is in the youth. Let me fix that youth. No one's sitting here saying, but wait a minute, they're coming up in a community where the community has been disenfranchised socially, economically, in all spheres. That's going to be the community that's more likely to have toxic chemicals in that area because the trucks are moving forward. It's going to be more likely to have more liquor stores than grocery stores and banks, if you will. And then we say, yes, that there's increased community violence, and you want to say this idea of Black on Black crime. Gotta be careful about that, because if you put any group of people in the situation that many folks have been in for centuries, for a very long time, then they're responding in a way that's set up because they have internalized the racism. They've internalized the negative messages. When you keep saying there's something wrong with Black families, that Black fathers aren't showing up, you're messaging to these children before they take their first breath that they're not supposed to succeed. I stand as someone who people would have called an at-risk youth. I'm glad I did not know that. Instead, I was loved and lifted by my community, even when my parents and my family fell short because of situations they were contending with. Yes, we've got some healing to do within our own communities. I'm not taking away from that. That's ours to do. And that is what ABPSI does with our theories, our practices, emotional emancipation circles, and other events. But at the same time, we have to bring awareness that the situations that we're in many times are not of our making. It's what's happening to us. And psychology inadvertently plays a role in that, either by omission, commission, or collusion. So case in point, if our economical value as psychologists is predicated upon individual opportunities, then there's more money to be made as a private practitioner than as a community psychologist. Yet healing happens more prevalently in a community psychology approach than in an individual therapy private practice. But capitalism is at play here. There's not much money to be had working deeply in the community traditionally. So I'm gonna stop here because I can tell I have a lot to share about this, and I want to thank my ABPSI founders and members who taught me all of this wisdom to bring forward as well too.
Thank you, Dr. Oh, yes, please, Dr. Jennings. Yep.
Well, wonderful, wonderful conversation occurring. I think from an Indigenous perspective, if I could just add, I am complete agreement. I mean, I believe there are wonderful things about Western psychology that, again, like I said, there's several theories that are foundational that have been founded upon some of our Indigenous cultures. Psychologists actually went and stayed with our tribal communities, then wrote these theories, that became theirs. So there is that side of it. But as well as psychology continues, I think even today, to reify some colonial notions that Dr. Jackson was also speaking of, and Dr. Tran as well. And I think it furthers some of these colonial agendas. So I appreciate the comment about decolonization, because I think to first start to talk about decolonizing how we approach mental health and well-being, we have to address those historical traumas. And in particular, again, yes, those historical traumas we see in some new research from our colleagues who do epigenetic research. I mean, it shows up again, right, in increased risk for autoimmune disorders, for chronic diseases, for mental health disorders. My colleague, Dr. Walters, has actually done some preliminary work looking at if your community was hit by massacres and relationship to anxiety rates today in some communities, as well as their boarding schools, higher rates of depression. So different traumas that occurred across communities can affect subsequent generations differently, right? And we know there's higher rates of pain, which lead to higher rates of addiction to cope with the pain. And if you have more oppression and marginalization, there's higher rates of pain and addiction. It's kind of this cycle that keeps occurring. And I think from Western psychology, we're often taught to treat the individual and to empower them, right, to make individual changes. And in my perspective, it often comes across as blaming the victim, right? Like, you got yourself into this somehow, so now you just need to do the CBT, the cognitive behavioral therapy suggestions that I have for you, and you'll get better next week. Just stick to the plan. And when that doesn't work, I think a lot of times as therapists, we're at a loss, right? But what I find is very effective is when we do have that community approach. And like I said, there are some aspects of Western psychology and other notions of healing that do coincide with some cultural notions of healing, such as group therapy, right? So as a clinical psychologist, I was trained to do talking circles and to work with community members coming together more in culturally appropriate methods. And then as well, working with the healers. I appreciate Dr. Jackson mentioned, they have healers and community members as part of ABPSI that come together and are recognized as such. And I think through a lot of our Indigenous clinics, even across North America, there's an integration of traditional healers, elders, and recognition of those people as being critical to healing. And I think we have to start to reframe too what therapy means. Being that I'm a Western trained clinician as well, I have to step aside and say, okay, what does it really mean to do therapy? And part of that, listening to community members in particular, and those who are much wiser than myself, is that we need to heal from this historical trauma first, right? We need to address that historical trauma. We need to find out ways that we can collectively heal, not just the individual going out and doing a training and doing some type of therapy on their own, but as a community, what do we need to do? And a lot of times for me in my work, that takes the form of going out upon Mother Earth, the land, getting back in touch with those ancestral practices and teachings, but really getting back in touch with that ancestral love, right? Because I feel like that's been the biggest disconnect in our communities, is that we've lost that connection to love, the love of Mother Earth, which is our first, mother, the love to each other, and being able to impart that love for generations. And as we review even the transcripts or interviews of those ancestors of my own who had to do a Trail of Tears walk, right, and a march after all these other atrocities that occurred to the community, every time my ancestors are quoted as talking about the love for the 7 generations forward, right? And talking about the love for their grandchildren. They're getting through this trauma because of their love for them. And in particular, I'm always struck because one of my personal ancestors wrote about carrying her brother on her back barefoot through the ice and snow, knowing that if she put him down, he would be murdered by the military who were accompanying them. And she did that because she loved the 7 generations forward from him, which is my children. So, I think about that enduring love, and through reconnecting to that love collectively as a group, I've seen so much healing within our communities. We've had individuals who talk about no longer needing pain medicine, no longer feeling that chronic pain after reconnecting with that love and having a new purpose and responsibility. But that being said, it doesn't excuse the ongoing racism and oppression and marginalization that's occurring within our communities, right? So to me, when I think about therapy and healing, I think about it as twofold. Not only do we need to reconnect with our strengths and our riches and our ancestral love that's there for us so that we can move forward and pass that love on to future generations, but we also need to figure out how we can come together and address this ongoing oppression and create a better environment so that, hopefully, as we get stronger and stronger with each generation, we can heal intergenerationally. But that's where it takes working together collectively as a group. I'm so honored to be part of this group here, coming together with different people, like-minded people who are looking to heal and work together with communities to do so.
If I could add,
Please do.
I agree. Yes, I agree with all the comments that my colleagues have made, all of them. And I will say that it's difficult to be the first one in your family. I'm the first generation immigrant. So basically, I'm the first one in my family to come to the United States. And I will say I have been lucky to have a good education in the United States, not to pay attention what people will tell me what I can or cannot do. But I have seen in a lot of Latinx youth that they fall into the cracks, whether they are foreign born or US born. And I think there's this need to do a heavy lifting in teachers and faculty and mental health providers to not to let those youth get lost. They have a lot of responsibilities with their families, with themselves, with their communities that sometimes teachers don't understand. And if they do, it's understood very poorly and in the lack of context of how important it is family or financially contributing for one's family through remittances that these kids take on their shoulders. So I have seen cases where youth are not formally mentored. They seek for a mentor or a faculty, but unfortunately, some of the faculty don't have time for them. And then when they get to grad school, the results are not as great. And what I try to do with my work is to encourage those students who are going to college or maybe considering going to college to not only advocate for themselves, but I too advocate for them. So it is coming from a collectivistic culture, asking for what you need sometimes is very hard because you want to put the family priorities first. But I have seen that with the effort to help the student and let not the student fall behind, there's a lot of damage that has been done for some Latinx students who have not been dedicated the time, whether it has been with bilingual education or more of the mentorship role, that they also belong in a space where most likely people do not look like them, but they do belong there. And so doing that heavy lifting for youth to believe that they belong in this place, in the places that they have worked very hard to be part of. I think that is something that we work at NLPA with the undergrad students, the grad students, to let them know that they are loved, appreciated, and they do belong in those places, not only in academia, but in other sectors that they wish to go. I will say that I do admire all the work that all mental health providers, especially those of color, do, because as much as we want the work to stop in our offices or in our clinics or in our community, sometimes we do, at least I experience fatigue, where sometimes we take the work home and it's all days a week. We care about people and we want the best for our communities. So I will say to all the youth who may sometimes doubt themselves, or whether their English was not good enough or their Spanish was not good enough, that too shall pass. That it's definitely not a definition of who you are, and but you have a village to support you. So I just wanted to add that comment for all the youth who are first generation or second generation immigrant to the United States and who have to navigate perhaps being an adolescent in adult roles, or being a young adult yet being a caregiver and a caretaker for their families.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez. It's been, I'm having some feedback. It should be okay. What I'm noticing is that we definitely have gone through a lot of questions here, including talking about how Western psychology has moved us away from the we mentality that I've heard from so many of what each of you have shared. And the fact that we have about 7 minutes left, or maybe 6, I'd love to invite all of you to come off of mute. And we have 2 questions left that we hopefully can get done in this time. And so the first is, as you all know, we're in partnership with Facebook and with Providence on a campaign called Wellness for All that wraps up this Sunday. Millions and millions of people have seen this content, have interacted with it. And I'd love for you to each of you to share, what does reclaiming our wellness and healing look like from a cultural perspective? And are there specific mind, body, or spirit traditions that are shared by all of our cultures in how we go about doing healing?
Well, I think we've already begun to articulate some of those. First and foremost, it's the realization that culture is not something alternative. It is an essence of who people are. It's part of us, if you will. So we always have to ask ourselves, what are the cultural practices and beliefs? And they're not the same across every generation. They will change because we are an adaptive people. But not to critically look at that can leave someone not fully aware of who they are and whose they are, if you will. Because if I understand who I am as a Black person and what it means to be valued in that Blackness, the fact that I love having kitchen table conversations with my family is an important thing. The fact that I love having family reunions that are multi-generational, our weddings, I don't leave my children at home, they're right in there with me. But these are not problematic. This is part of my essence that keeps me whole and well. So that when I'm faced with such challenges, try to recognize, now, did I just get dissed? First of all, did I just get dissed in this social setting, may it be at a store, work, or what have you? And if so, did it have something to do with the person just having a bad day, or did it have something to do with implicit bias in my being Black? Because if I don't go through that type of quick self-analysis, I can very quickly take on someone else's stuff, begin to believe again, as I said, there's something wrong with me. So first of all, just remembering who we are. I want to lift up the work that Dr. Wade Nobles gave us, this concept that he recaptured for us called Zola, Z-O-L-A. And Zola is a Kakongo term that means an activating, tranquil, protective love. So the mantra that we've adopted during this time of COVID has been Zola up on we. So how do we Zola up on we? Which means that when I do see people of color, but definitely Black folks, I want to look them eye to eye and really genuinely see them, because we're in a world that moves so fast, we miss each other, right? And that leaves us further invisible. So if I'm able to once again look into the eyes of Black and brown and say, I see you, I value you, I got you, just in that look, that's that Zola up on we love. When we're sitting in our isolations, as many of us are still the only ones in a particular setting. It could be in our place of worship. It could be in our work setting, wherever it may be, where we can feel comfortable in there based on what brought us there, but still part of us is still sort of on the outside. I can't fully exhale in this setting because there's some ways of how you're being that doesn't fully embrace all of who I am as a cultural person, as a Black person. So first of all, just Zola up on we, remembering that we are each other's best medicine. I would also say too, as I said, being very strategic of trying to have conversations within your own communities, within your own family. Tell me about my family. What does it mean to be Black? The goodness of Black, what's our real story? So people can decide for themselves what they want to take on. Not everyone of African ancestors is going to embrace what I'm sharing, but don't they have a right to critically examine and discern for themselves?
I'm going to add to that, because the words that come to mind for me very quickly are whole, balance. We and our people deserve to have liberation, wholeness, balance, and freedom. And that must include all of what has come before us and all that is coming to us now. And so many of our people are striving to be something and seek approval outside of our community. And we should have the freedom to do so, but in a liberated way. The idea of code switching, I think, is a fallacy that, it's something that we're doing, but should not be the goal. And that I must be able to be my whole self from setting to setting, rather than having to switch between different identities. And for our, Asian American community, we must have more to choose from. We're constantly being told that we have to choose, Black or white. But what is Asian? And we have not yet been able to define that for ourselves. And certainly culture can be a place of trauma as well. And we deserve to be allowed to deconstruct that and to heal from that, rather than feeling as though we have to protect it because no one else will. So liberation, wholeness, freedom, I must be able to investigate all that is me. And to be able to participate in and define for myself what it means to be Vietnamese American, Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander, because those things have been defined for me, and my people are stuck back in where we were, 40 years ago when my family migrated, rather than an evolution of what it means to be from my cultural origins. I must not be frozen in time, So I'll leave it at that.
Say, I completely agree with those statements. I mean, I often say I don't walk in two worlds. I don't think it's healthy to walk in two worlds. I am who I am, and if people don't like it, then, that's just who I am. I bring my culture with me, right? And when I think about how do we heal or reclaim, it's like we are all future ancestors in the making. Every one of us, right?
I love
And
that.
so we need to be focused on what kind of legacy do we want to leave for our future ancestors to be, right? And reclaiming it and knowing that my ancestors loved me. They loved all of us. And, for me to become the best ancestor I possibly can, and encourage that love and forward that love to others. And I just encourage everyone else to know your responsibilities as a future ancestor and what we need to do today to make those other generations healthy as they can be.
I need that t-shirt.
Mhm.
And also remembering, I will say, where we come from. Remember that all the efforts from our families, those abuelitas, grandparents, their parents before then, all their love for us to be able to stand where we are, to remind youth and to remind our communities of color that they are not alone. I might have said this before in a different session, that you're not alone. Whenever you come in your room, you have a whole tribe with you. You bring your whole family with you. When you smile, when you look at people, that's perhaps your mom or your dad smiling back at you, and you're sitting in the shoulders of giants. So you are not alone when you coming in the room. You may perceive like that because maybe you are your own unique universe, you are your own unique world, and maybe you may be having a party with yourself only, but that is perhaps an invitation for other people to realize, perhaps not you. I want to thank you, all of you. I think this has been a really great conversations, and I'm looking forward for more.
Thank you, Dr. Chavez. I appreciate that. I am a future ancestor, and I am not alone. As we round out our time today, I just want to say thank you to Dr. Johnson Jennings, Dr. Tran, Dr. Jackson, Dr. Chavez, for my own well-being first and foremost, and also for sharing so much of your wisdom with everybody today. And we'll be looking forward to doing this again, I hope. And we really appreciate everyone who's been listening and for sending their questions. If you're looking for medical advice, please visit providence.org. And to make sure to follow us on social media at Providence on Twitter and under Providence Health System on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. And also you'll see in the comments each of our different groups here: the American Black Psychologists Association, the Asian American Psychological Association, the Institute for Indigenous Wellness Research Institute, and the National Latinx Psychological Associations. You should be able to follow them as well too. And also we'll provide donation links for each of these organizations so you can help to further their work. And please do reach out to them if you'd like to know more or participate in any of their programs. Thank you, everybody, for your time today, and we will see you hopefully soon.